In 1810, a long poem about a wild, mountainous corner of Scotland was published, and almost overnight, readers packed their bags and headed north to see it for themselves. The lake described in the poem was real, Loch Katrine, but there was barely a proper road leading to it. Visitors arrived in such numbers that inns opened, coach routes multiplied, and a small regional tourist economy sprang up almost from nothing. It is one of the rare moments in history when a poem alone reshaped a landscape's fortunes. So what was in these verses that moved people so deeply? A king traveling in disguise, a Highland chieftain torn between love and honor, a young woman willing to risk everything for her exiled father. Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake was at once a love story and a story about identity itself. Let's get into it. First, the author. Walter Scott was born in Edinburgh in 1771. A childhood illness left him permanently lame, and much of his boyhood was spent on his grandfather's farm in the countryside. There, he absorbed old Scottish ballads, border legends, and oral folk tales that would later run through nearly everything he wrote. He trained as a lawyer and practiced law for years, but literature was always his real passion. He began by collecting and publishing vanishing old ballads from the Scottish border country. Then he turned to writing long narrative poems of his own. When The Lady of the Lake appeared, it made Scott the best-selling and most celebrated English-language poet of his day. At the time, Scotland was often seen as a shadow of England, a somewhat forgotten corner of Britain. Scott's verse carried the Highland mountains, clan traditions, sword-bearing chieftains, and mist-covered lochs straight into the center of literary culture. In doing so, he revived outside interest in Scotland and helped the country reimagine itself. Here is a curious detail. After this poetic success, Scott turned to writing novels, and for years he published them anonymously. Readers of the time gave the mysterious author a nickname, the Great Unknown, and it was only much later that Scott revealed himself as the author behind Waverley, Ivanhoe, and Rob Roy. In 1820, he was made a baronet and became Sir Walter Scott. Toward the end of his life, the collapse of a publishing house he was a partner in left him with an overwhelming debt. He wrote day and night to pay it off, a punishing effort that wore down his health, and he died in 1832. Now to the story itself. The Lady of the Lake is a long narrative poem in 6 cantos, set in the mountainous heart of the Scottish Highlands in the 16th century. A young huntsman, calling himself James Fitzjames, becomes separated from his party after a long stag hunt, exhausted and alone, and finds himself on the shore of Loch Katrine, deep in an isolated forest.
Orada yeni bir yolculuğa çıkan yabancı sakin gençle küçük bir teknede geçen ırmağı bulur. Adı Alan'dır ve kitabın adını Irmağın Sultanı olan Alan'dır. Alan, kurtuluşa kavuşmak üzere oğlunun olduğunu sanan babasıyla birlikte gizli bir yerde saklanmaktadır. Babası, krallıkta yitirilmiş bir nimettir ve tek dostu da kızı Alan'dır. Alan da gizlice yaşamaktadır. Aynı zamanda Irmağın Sultanı gibi gizli yaşayan oğlunun olduğunu sanan babasıyla birlikte yaşama başlayan Alan'dır. Oğlunun olduğunu sanan babasıyla birlikte yaşama başlayan Alan'dır.
But in return, he wants to marry Ellen. She, however, feels only sisterly affection for him because her heart belongs to another young man, Malcolm Graham. The stranger huntsman is welcomed with genuine hospitality, but keeps his own identity hidden. In truth, he is the disguised king himself, James V of Scotland. Back in the capital, Fitzjames learns that Roderick is preparing to rise up against the crown, and royal forces are mobilized. Roderick and Fitzjames, neither knowing who the other truly is, clash in single combat on the road. Roderick is wounded and taken prisoner. Douglas, to protect his daughter and his people, decides to surrender himself to the king, concealing his own identity as he does so. At the poem's climax, surprise follows surprise. Roderick dies in captivity. Ellen travels to the king's court to beg for her father's pardon, and there she discovers that the courteous stranger she met while hunting was the king all along. The king pardons Douglas and grants Ellen permission to marry Malcolm, the man she loves. The story is built around a disguised king, an exiled nobleman, and 2 men in love with the same woman. But Scott never treats it as merely a romance. He weaves in Highland clan culture, codes of honor, traditions of hospitality, and the tension between the crown and the clans. The nature writing throughout is so vivid that readers feel as though they are standing on the shore of Loch Katrine themselves. Scott keeps the verse moving quickly, using short, strongly accented lines, much as he had in his earlier poem, The Lay of the Last Minstrel, so the poem reveals its full power when heard aloud rather than merely read, much like the old Scottish ballads it draws from. What keeps The Lady of the Lake alive today is not only its plot, but the very real effect it had on the world. This poem produced one of the earliest cases of literary tourism in the modern sense. Readers wanted to see the lake and mountains described in its verses, and travel to the Trossachs surged almost overnight. Scott also helped Scotland rediscover its own identity through this work. Highland culture had largely been viewed up till then as wild and backward. Through Scott's pen, it was redefined as honorable, passionate, and worthy of respect. The romantic, misty, mountainous image people still associate with Scotland today owes a great deal to Scott's legacy. The poem also raises questions about identity and appearance. How does a king behave once he has hidden his rank? How is a person recognized as human before they are recognized by title? Those questions feel just as alive 2 centuries later. The poem also handles the tension between clan honor and state authority with real nuance. Roderick Dhu is not written as a villain. He simply follows the code of his own world faithfully. Scott never forces the reader to take sides, and instead lets 2 different worlds collide with mutual respect. Perhaps the poem's most surprising legacy lives on in music. A hymn Ellen sings in the 2nd canto was later set to music by the composer Franz Schubert. The piece, now one of the most recognized works in all of classical music, and commonly known as Ave Maria,
traces its origin to a German translation of this very poem. Another curious connection is Hail to the Chief, the march played to announce American presidents, whose lyrics were inspired by lines from The Lady of the Lake. A poem set among Scottish mountains, in other words, left its mark on both one of Europe's most beloved sacred melodies and American presidential ceremony. Scott himself became a celebrated public figure after the poem's success, so much so that in 1822, while organizing King George IV's state visit to Edinburgh, he staged ceremonies that turned Highland dress and tartan into enduring national symbols. The book reached extraordinary sales figures within its first year, a genuine literary sensation by the standards of its day. And that success brought Scott both real wealth and a reputation as the leading writer of his time, at least until his novels eclipsed even his poetry. We have covered The Lady of the Lake, but to truly feel that mountain air and lake mist in Scott's verses, the poem deserves to be heard as an audiobook. If you would like to listen to the complete work, you will find the link in the description. Subscribe for more books in this series. Until the next one, remember the young woman who appeared in a boat on the shore of Loch Katrine, because a true identity never stays hidden behind a disguise for long. And remember, too, that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when a hunter loses his way and washes up on an unfamiliar shore.